Shalom, this is Rabbi Johnny Solomon, the virtual rabbi. I hope you're well. This Shabbat we read Parshat Metzora, the Parsha describing what happens to the person who's been afflicted with Tzora'at. This Shabbat is also Shabbat Hagadol, the Shabbat of greatness that precedes Pesach. We're going to go through the Shi'ur and learn through some beautiful ideas relating to Parshat Metzora, which is sometimes often overlooked by Shabbos HaGadol. And of course, as always, our learning is Le'ilui Neshama, is for the lifting of the soul of my dear friend Lenny Borgi Ben Shmuel. Let us begin. We begin early on in the Parsha, where we're taught about the purification ceremony of somebody who's been afflicted with Tzora'at, but who is now beginning the journey of returning to the Machane Israel, the Israelite camp. And we're told that Tzivah HaKohen v'lakach le'metaher shtei tziporim chayot torot ve'etz erez hashni tolad be'ezov. The Kohen shall order, shall command, and the person to be cleansed shall take 2 live clean birds, a cedar stick, a thread of crimson, and a hyssop branch. Now, what are all of these about? And in particular, we're going to be focusing on the birds, which some understand to be a swallow, others understand to be a sparrow. But we're taught that part of this ceremony involves birds. And why? Rashi addresses this question and tells us the following. Torot prat le'of tameh. Here we're told this is pure birds, meaning you're not allowed to have non-kosher birds in this ceremony. And then he asks, as it says in English, why are birds required for this cleansing rite? Because lefi shenegaim ba'im al lashon hara. Because Tzora'at comes primarily, although not exclusively, for the sin of Lashon Hara. Shu maseh pitputi dvarim. And what is Lashon Hara? It's about the prattling of words, by way saying things that we shouldn't say, and saying harmful words. Lefikach huskoku lataharato tziporim shemetpatpatim tamid betzivtzuvko. Therefore we use birds which constantly twitter, as if to remind us of this sin. According to the simplest way of reading Rashi, the reason we have birds as part of the ceremony of liberating the Metzora and helping them return back to the Machane Israel is to remind them of what they've done. They prattled and then they twittered, and so too do the birds, and so they look at the birds and they realize there's a symbolic message here. They shouldn't repeat the sin that they'd performed. That's one way of reading Rashi. But let's see other ways of interpreting what Rashi is saying, or at least other ways of understanding the meaning and the symbolism of these birds. We move on to a book, a sefer that was just recently published, titled The Heart of the Parsha by Rabbi Jeremy Finn. And here he provides us with a beautiful summary of different explanations as to why birds are used. And in particular, what he focuses on isn't why is birds used, but why is 2 birds used. Rashi says that Tzora'at is a result of Lashon Hara, which is an act of unnecessary twittering of words, so the sacrifice that is brought are 2 twittering birds, as said. The Pirion, that's Rav Shlomo Gansfried, asks that we can understand why it is necessary to bring birds to hint to the Metzora he is in this situation because he twittered like a bird. But why 2, asks Rabbi Finn. Why 1 should be enough to deliver that message. And Rav Shlomo Gansfried therefore gives us a fascinating answer. The Pirion suggests that had the Metzora only brought 1 bird, he would have thought it is to atone for his loose lips, and thus from now on he's going to be quiet and not talk. In that way he will avoid any future transgression of Lashon Hara. Therefore a 2nd bird is brought that remains alive. This indicates the Metzora that while careless talk can cause destruction, positive words create life. We'll return to that point a little bit later on. The pasuk, Hachayim v'Amout b'yad lashon, life and death are in the hands of the tongue, which means that speech has the power of life as well, to learn, speak words of Torah, perform chesed with speech, etc. Hashem does not want us to be silent. He just instructs us how to use the power of our speech correctly. Therefore 2 birds are brought, one to remind the Metzora that he is in the predicament because of his twittering, i.e. his negative, harmful speech, and the second is not killed but is set free, so that we're supposed to speak, but only in a way that brings life through the learning of Torah and the observance of mitzvahs. I think this is exquisite. I think it's so beautiful. It helps us understand what is the message of these Shtei Tziporim. But I want to give you a further explanation about the Shtei Tziporim, and this is found in the Torah commentary Maim Amukim of Rabbi Yehuda Birdugo. And what does he say? He tells us, as mentioned, this is taking place as a person is going through the cleansing ceremony, right? The final ceremony of them returning back to the Machane Israel. Shtei Tziporim. He says, what happened to this Metzora? Well, if you've been following through the verses from Tatzir Metzora, you'll know that somebody who's afflicted with Tzorat has to leave their house and they go out of Machane Israel, meaning they've been dislodged, they've been having to leave their regular place of residence, they've been cast out. And so the person has been cast out of their home, a bit like a bird often flies from place to place. It insiporim tarato, and so why are birds used? Birds are used just as a bird wishes to find its way back to its nest, so too somebody who's been afflicted with tzarat is being blessed that they should find their way back to their nest. And he quotes a pasuk from Tehillim, Perek Pei Daled, Gam tzipor matza bayit l'dror kanla. Even a bird found a house, and a swallow her rest. Meaning, if a bird can find a place to rest, surely we should be blessed with that opportunity as well. And so, the bird doesn't just represent the sin of the Metzora. That's the way you could read Rashi. I think that's Parshat of Rashi. It doesn't just also, the 2 birds represent the duality of being careful with our speech but using it properly. But it also represents coming home, finding the nest, and being able to start anew. With that in mind, let's move on. Let's move on to the next set of psukim. And we're told the following: Ki tavo el eretz Canaan asher ani noten lachem la'achuza v'natayti neged tzorat b'beit eretz l'achuzatchem. When you come to the land of Canaan, the land of Eretz Israel, which I'm giving you as a possession, and I place a legion of tzorat upon a house in the land of your possession, meaning we know that tzorat can afflict clothes and homes and a person themselves. And here it's referring to tzorat on a home, neged bayit. And we're being told that this occurs in the houses in Eretz Israel. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu says it's going to happen when you enter the land of Israel, having, wandered in the desert for 40 years. And Rashi explains the following: Atati neged tzorat, b'sar shehi lehem she'anega'im ba'im alehem, lefi shitmina amoraim matmoniot shel zahav bekirot batehem kol 40 shana shel Yisrael b'midbar. What is this telling us? While the Israelites were walking and traveling in the desert, who were living in Eretz Israel? The Amoraim, the Amorites. And they built houses, and in those houses they hid gold, and they hid jewels. And when the Israelites will then come, and then they'll live in those houses, and Tzorat will afflict those houses, they'll then have to reveal parts of the wall, and they'll discover these treasures. Through the Tzorat, they'll discover this treasure. It's a very strange thing when you think about it, because surely Tzorat is because somebody's done something wrong, but now we're being told that when Tzorat comes onto the house, they're going to reveal something good. Let's see what this is all about. And I want to share with you the beautiful insights of the Bavitcher Rebbe. And he explains in Birun and Pirush Rashi al Torah something which perhaps we may have overlooked. But which people were we being referred to? The Amorites. And what does the word amor mean, or amar mean in Hebrew? It means to say. He says the following, L'shitat Rashi, ha'imatmoniyot etzel amoreim. According to Rashi, the jewels were only in the Amorite houses. It doesn't say in all houses, only those. And he says the reason for this, I believe, is as follows. He says, I believe that Nagaim, the primary reason, is for speaking badly. That is, saying bad things. Amira. That is a connection between the Amorites and the jewels that they put in the walls, because there's a connection with the word Amira and the Amorites. Omnam le'idach, he says, alternatively, the reason why jewels are found only in these houses, he says, the reason why people get Nagaim isn't just to tell people off and say you've spoken wrong, you've spoken badly. It's to transform the power of speech. Not just to say don't speak, but to teach us how to, like Rabbi Finn explained. From the negative form of speaking to a sanctified way of speaking. There we're told that towards the end of Sefer Bereshit, that Kadosh Baruch Hu says, I've given you the land where the Amorites had previously been living, and I did so with my sword and with my bow. And what does Uncle say on that? With my prayer and with my supplication. How did the Jewish people get the land? It was through replacing one nation who were there with another, which occurred through the transformation of the landscape, through the power of words, of prayers and of supplications. That is to say, this whole story about the Amorite houses isn't just about negative speech, but about positive speech. And he continues, he says, when you speak with sanctity, with holiness, it reveals the jewels in the soul, not just the jewels in the wall. It reveals the jewels in the soul. That is the inner soul of a person. Because the whole power of speech is that it comes to reveal and express the nature of a person's soul. In a way that all my limbs and all my whole being is able to express my desire to serve you, God. And this is an idea which Chassidus speaks about quite regularly. Isn't this a beautiful way of understanding that Rashi? It's not just Amorite, it's about Amira. It's not just about the negative, it's also about the positive. It's about revealing the jewels within our soul. And that's what Parshat Metzora is about, and that's what Rabbi Finn said by telling us it's two birds, not just one. Let's go on to our final pasuk. Uva asher elo habayit v'gid hakohen lemor keneged nira li b'bayit. And we're told that the person whose house is his comes and tells a Kohen something like a lesion has appeared to me in the house. We're told that they're not allowed to say, I definitely know it's Tzaraat. They say to the Kohen, I think I have Tzaraat. And then the Kohen then comes to confirm. The Gemara asks an interesting question. Why does a pasuk emphasize that it's this person's house? Uva asher lo habayit. It seems quite insistent that this house is possessed by that person. And he explains the following. Asher lo lamani. Why do I need to be told that the house is his in this emphatic way? Mish miyached bayit lo. Somebody who is keeps his house to himself. This refers to somebody who isn't just the owner of the house, but somebody who's very possessive, with their possessions in their house. They don't lend things to people. When people come along and say, do you have a mixer? Do you have a pen? Do you have, a paintbrush? He says, I haven't got anything. But what then happens? If Tzora'at comes on the house, you know what he has to do? He has to take out all his things to the street. And then people say, you had the paintbrush, you had the mixer, you had the pen. So, what is it significant? Because I mentioned before, Lashon Hara is considered to be the primary cause of Torah. It's not the only. And the Gemara in Erechin basically lists to us different reasons why Torah comes on a person. And one of them is called Tzarat Ayin. What is Tzarat Ayin? Stinginess. And this is what the Gemara is referring to. That one of the reasons a person gets Torah is because they're stingy. In fact, the Gemara goes on to say that's why if you lend things to people, then Torah is less likely, almost not likely, to come onto your house. That's a pitaron. Why? Because it shows a graciousness, a generosity of spirit. And with this in mind, I want us to reflect on a beautiful insight by Rav Pam, who not only talks about the Parshat, but talks about the Haftarah as well, and gives us a deep lesson in Musa. And he says, Tzora'at comes because of Tzarat Ayin, amongst other reasons. And when a person then puts his things out into the street, as I said, as he writes his selfishness, it becomes publicized to us all. But then Rav Pam says the following. We see something interesting in the Haftarah. The Haftarah Parshat Metzora recounts an incident about Gehazi, who together with his 3 sons was afflicted with Tzora'at. Gehazi is one of the most tragic figures mentioned in Tanakh. He was a chief disciple and assistant to Elisha Navi, just as Yoshua been Moshe's assistant and eventually inherited the mantle of leadership of Klal Yisrael, and Elisha had been the assistant and eventual successor of Eliyahu Navi. It is reasonable to assume that Gehazi could have succeeded his master Elisha. In fact, Elisha entrusted him with the mission of reviving the dead child of the Shunammite woman. Yet Gehazi is listed in the Mishnah as having forfeited his share in the world to come. A number of reasons are given for this, among them that he disparaged Torah scholars and was chaytiv machdet Rabbi. He was a sinner who led others to sin. But what's this got to do with our parasha? He then goes on to say, the Yerushalmi says that Gehazi was a great Talmid Chacham. He had 3 major character flaws which brought about his ruin. The first of which was Einav Tzara Talmidim. He had a stingy eye towards his students. When his master Elisha delivered the shir, Gehazi sat outside at the entrance to the yeshiva. When the Talmidim came to the lecture, they said, if Gehazi is not attending the shir, there's probably nothing worth hearing. And they left. Thus Elisha sat and expounded without people benefiting from his wisdom. Just think about that. What a waste. This eventually led to the banishment of Gehazi by Elisha, who removed him from his position as administrator of the yeshiva. Why did Gehazi do this, though? Listen to this, because this isn't just a message from the time of the prophets, it's a message which is prophetic to our time. Instead of looking at every student as a future Navi, he considered each one to be an extra financial burden whom he had to feed, clothe, and support. Thus he restricted and discouraged students from entering the yeshiva, thereby depriving the nation of potential profits. Meaning, Gehazi saw students as a financial burden, not as a spiritual gem who can bring light to our nation. That's a Tzarat Ayin. It's not seeing the greatness of people, instead being stingy. And that stinginess diminished Torah in Am Yisrael. For his own selfish reasons, Gehazi discouraged Talmidim from learning from their Rabbi. On the flip side, says Rav Pam, the Mechilta and Parshas Bay says that Aaron HaKohen's conduct was the very opposite. The Pasuk says, Dabru el kol adat Yisrael, speak to the entire assembly of Israel. Why is a plural tense used when only Moshe was commanded to speak to the nation? The Mechilta answers that although Aaron was Moshe's oldest brother, and had been the leader of the nation for decades during the Egyptian exile before Moshe replaced him, he was completely subservient to Moshe. As Moshe expounded on the mitzvah, Aaron reverently strained his ear to catch every word that emanated from Moshe's mouth. When the people saw how Aaron exerts himself to learn, they too were inspired to catch every word. Meaning, unlike Gehazi, who dismissed people whose body language showed a certain disregard and disdain and undervaluing of people learning, Aaron a Cohen was the opposite. He showed that everybody should learn. Thus it was Aaron's behavior that encouraged them to listen attentively, and therefore Torah considered as both Moshe and Aaron addressed the nation, because he caused others to want to listen. He caused others to want to learn. Thus what we see a contrast between the character flaws of one Talmid Chacham, which drove many away from Torah, and the admirable traits of another, which served to draw many closer to Torah. And this teaches us how we shouldn't be stingy, how we shouldn't have an ayin ra, how we shouldn't be tzaras ayin. And especially if we're busy for the next week because of Pesach and people need something that we may have, if we can, we should lend. And before, during, and after, we should do the same. And that's a way to prevent tzaraat coming into our house. That's a way to prevent, really, tragedy. So, let's go back and do some quick review. We began by talking about the birds, the korbanot of the Shtei Tziporim Chayot Torot. We saw Rashi, which seems to imply that this is all about emphasizing the negativity, the sin of the Metzora. But in fact, Rabbi Finn says, no, it's there to teach us about how we need to avoid speaking bad, but also we should speak good. We saw the beautiful teaching in the Maimon Mokim that says it's about helping a person be rehabilitated, finding their way back home. We then moved on to Psukim relating to the Amoraim, right? The Amorites. Why them? And says a beautiful Babich Rebbe, because Lashon Amira, and it's to teach us that within our very being is a capacity, are the jewels of saying great things. And then we went on to say, what is the idea of Ova Asher Lo Habayit? Why is the emphasis on the possessiveness of the person of their home? Because that's one of the reasons people got Metzora. And the lesson is not to have Tzarat Ayin, but instead be generous of spirit, and in so doing, bring more good to the world. I wish you all Shabbat Shalom.